This intro is boring. How about we spice it up?
If you've been part of a nerd culture for the last couple of years, then you've most likely heard of the name Toby Fox. He's composed music for games such as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Homestuck, and many other projects, and he's also a programmer, which you might know, since one of his projects has definitely made a cultural impact, not only on himself, but the people who've experienced this project. And that project is none other than the Earthbound Halloween hack, which I haven't played, but apparently Toby doesn't like it, so I really don't know. Oh yeah, he also created this obscure indie game called... I think it's impossible for you to not know what Undertale is, considering how impactful it's been on pop culture for the last half a decade. I mean, come on, the funny skeleton man is literally a me costume in Smash Ultimate, so that's to tell you enough. But for those who so happen to live under a rock, I'll make this brief. Undertale is a 2015 RPG game where you play as a child named Frisk who falls down a hole leading them to the underground, a place where monsters have been living there for God knows how long, and now you must escape the underground and go back to the surface. What makes Undertale so unique is that, unlike a traditional RPG where you kinda need to kill everything in your path and grind out EXP to level up your character, is that you can beat the game without hurting any boss or enemy. Hell, the game basically encourages you not to hurt them. However, they do give you the option to kill the monsters, but it will be creating a totally different experience than the experience you'll be getting by not killing the monsters, thus creating a very interesting duality. The definition of duality is an instance of opposition or contrast between two concepts or two aspects of something. Undertale's duality comes in with the choice that the player will make to either spare or kill the monsters, creating two major routes, the pacifist and the genocide route. The pacifist route, you have a fun adventure where you meet a bunch of wacky and lovable characters while getting into shenanigans like eating butterscotch pie, date a skeleton, watch a snail race, date a lesbian fish warrior to try to kill you earlier in the game, be on a game show with a killer robot, help a lesbian dinosaur get with the lesbian fish warrior from a while back, and how could anyone forget finding out that the king of the monsters that people have been warning for the entirety of the game is actually a nice guy trying to do what's best for his people and deeply regretting killing the other children for you, having no other option but to fight him. When they do give you the option to spare him, a fucking flower comes in and kills him, absorbs all the human souls, crashes the game, you fight him after he turns into an eldritch abomination, the game turns back to normal as you play normally again, and when you think everything is going to be the same, your friends come in and say goodbye, only for the flower to come back and absorb every human soul and monster soul, revealing that he's actually the dead son of the king and queen of the monsters named Azrael. And then when you fight his strongest form, only to find out that he's doing all this to keep the human, who he thinks is his adopted sibling, alive. Still with me? Good. Did I forget to mention that you can pet dogs in this game? But the genocide route? Oh, that's a different story. You see, by doing the genocide route, you aren't just going around and killing every enemy you see. No, that'd be too easy. Instead, you deliberately go out of your way to find monsters and kill them. This does not only include the normal enemies, but the friends you made in the pacifist route. Toriel trying to stop you from leaving the ruins? Dead. Papyrus believing that even though you treated him like shit for the entirety of Snowden, still see some good inside of you? Dead. Literally one hit killing Undyne only for her to regenerate as an even stronger monster? Yeah, like that was a problem before. Dead. Alphys? Actually, we never encounter Alphys in this route, so who knows. Mettaton unleashed an even stronger version of himself to stop you? What a fucking joke. Dead. Sans, when in the middle of having a brutally hard boss fight against him, still see some good inside you? Dead. And Flowey, the closest person here that you can call a friend in this route, he's the only thing standing in their way. Fuck the fact that he's begging for us to spare him. So yeah, as you can clearly tell, the fun adventure that I mentioned earlier in the pacifist route is as good as gone. And the worst part, no matter what you do and who you kill, the game will make you remember that your actions have consequences. Even if you end up resetting after killing your favorite character, it doesn't matter. One way or another, this game will remind you of the actions you've done. But wait a second, I thought this video was about Deltarune. Why the hell am I talking about Undertale? Well, my fellow viewer, it's good to have an understanding of how duality is integrated in Undertale, because the way Deltarune integrates its duality is far more interesting. And while many people might be pointing to Chapter 2, I argue it starts with Deltarune Chapter 1. So let's start with that. Chapter 1 is, all things considered, the complete opposite of what Undertale really was. In its first couple of minutes, you can already tell the big difference between Deltarune, and those changes can be summarized by the chapter's most iconic phrase. your choices doesn't matter. And it's right, you the player aren't really given many choices, and even the choices you end up deciding won't really affect the overall route of the chapter, making it pretty linear for the most part. I do say for the most part, since there are some changes if you end up attacking the enemies and overall just acting like a dick. For example, if you end up lowering the enemy's health, they don't die, instead they just run away, and the ending is pretty different as well. So while it does have a few changes depending on your actions, the overall chapter is basically the same if you end up attacking or not, but even then the overall adventure is really fun. However, there is one very interesting character that you can find if you desire to, and if you've played Deltarune before, you know exactly who I'm talking about, and if you don't, let's just say that this certain individual can do anything.
I can do anything!
This, my friends, is where Jevil comes into play. Jevil's a mystery boss that you can encounter if you got back to the castle's first elevator and hit the option with a bunch of question marks, where we find Jevil trapped in a jail cell. He speaks of how innocent he is and how even though he may be locked away, it's really the people outside that are trapped and he's free. So after asking the player if they want to play a game, we are now tasked to find a set of broken key fragments. Upon finding and fixing said fragments, we go back to Jevil, and no matter if we decide to use the key or not, the door opens and we encounter and fight Jevil in an honestly pretty hard boss fight, and we end up defeating him. Now what's interesting about Jevil is not actually the fight against him, but rather the context of how he became like this. If you visit the shopkeeper that gave you the first key fragment, Sean, after fighting Jevil, there's some dialogue where he talks about him, and what he says is actually really interesting.
He was a funny little man. Once the court jester, I the court magician. A friend? Could I consider him a friend? Perhaps, perhaps not, but he was the only one who matched me in the games we used to play. One day he met a strange someone, and since then, he began to change. He started saying bizarre things that didn't completely make sense, but didn't completely not make sense either. Soon, he began to see the world as a game, and everyone as its participants. As the court mage and his only companion, I was forced to lock him away, or rather, lock us all away, in his own words. Since that time, the strange words he said have stuck inside my cotton, and my view of this world has become darker, yet darker. Reflecting on these memories, I think perhaps I miss playing games with him, and I wonder if I hadn't been asked to lock him up, would I have found a little more purpose in my life?
But this line right here, one day he met a strange someone and since then began to change, implying that Jevil wasn't like this before. That line specifically caught my eye and made me wonder, who exactly is this strange somebody? Have we met them before? Will we meet them? Could they have possibly been in contact with the mysterious knight we've heard of during the game? Is it the knight themselves? And most importantly, have they corrupted others as well? This, plus the ending of the chapter, opened up discussion of what to expect in the future of this game. Speaking of the ending, it's definitely a cliffhanger, I'll tell you that much. What the fuck just happened is definitely an appropriate response to that ending, because holy shit, I did not expect that at all. Chris just grabs their soul and throws it into a cage and then pulls out a knife. Like, what? And with that, we were left wondering what happens next. And after a couple of years, development issues with switching back and forth with engines, hiring new peoples, planning out the entire story, Toby suffering from wrist pains, and overall becoming a much larger project than Undertale was, Chapter 2 came out in late 2021. And holy shit did it blow any expectations I had for this game out of the water. It's definitely a far more charming experience than Chapter 1, which is saying a lot because that was already a really charming chapter within itself, and expanded its duality on a much darker path. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. So you know I just mentioned before that I think that Chapter 1 is basically the complete opposite of what Undertale did with its duality? Well, I feel like Chapter 2 is basically a direct response to the quote I mentioned earlier in Chapter 1. If that statement is true, that our choices don't matter, then why don't we make it matter? Or to an extent, why don't we make our actions affect another person whose actions do matter? And with that, let me introduce you to this chapter's version of the genocide route, often called by fans the Snowgrave route. The Snowgrave route is in concept similar to the genocide route, but in execution it's vastly different. The main reason? Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary peeps, let me introduce you to the newest character of your party, Noelle Holiday. Outside of gameplay herself, Noelle is honestly a really interesting character, especially the arc she goes through in the normal route, as she has a feeling of helplessness, and often struggles to stand up for herself. But throughout the normal route, we get to see her go through this arc after she joins our party. She opens up to Chris about their childhood. She overcomes her fear of mice and starts helping out the gang with her puzzles. But most importantly, she stands up for herself, and because of that, she saves the day from Queen. But the Snowgrave route? Oh boy! You still team up with Noel, but your intentions are far worse with how you interact with her outside and inside a battle. You see, Noel is technically the only character in your party able to kill enemies by freezing them solid using an attack called Ice Shock, so you the player aren't even killing the monsters yourself, but practically manipulating Noel to do the killing instead. What's even more unnerving is the fact that the enemies remain frozen solid in the overworld after death. However, in terms of how you interact with Noel outside of battle, I argue it's even worse. Chris, or rather you the player, feels far more controlling and sinister than in the normal route, often ordering her to do something against her will or telling her to proceed. Later in the route, we also see a change in attitude from Noel herself, sometimes even saying that the actions we forced her to do were something that she needed to do to become stronger. And after all of that, it all builds up to probably one of the most recognizable parts of this route. The battle against Birdly. If you played Chapter 2, you would know that you aren't really supposed to take Birdly seriously in the slightest. I mean, the guy literally calls himself a pro gamer and mentions wave dashing at some point. It's like he's so pathetic, but like at the same time, you just can't help but love his goofy attitude. However, when you encounter him with his fight between us and Noel, instead of having a goofy misunderstanding of Birdly thinking Chris is forcing Noel to be on our side, in the Snowgrave route, that's actually the case, and it's not even played off as a joke anymore. Noel doesn't even recognize Birdly at first, just calling him another enemy, and noticing that something's wrong, he just snaps Noel out of it and asks Chris what's going on. And just like we've been doing for the entirety of the route, we just continue to proceed. And with that, the battle against Birdly begins, where his attacks feels far more deadly and harder to dodge. However, they're building up PT, Noel casts her newest spell named Snowgrave, but she doesn't know how to use it, but we continue to tell her to use it until she snaps and uses the spell despite not knowing how to use it, and in the process freezes Birdly. And see how he ends up being in the real world? It's not really a stretch to say that bro kinda died. And I think that's exactly what makes these routes so sinister. They paint the player from a protagonist to an antagonist because that's what basically you end up becoming. And that's the keyword here. You, the player, end up becoming the antagonist. In both chapters, Chris ends up ripping the player outside their body and trapping it somewhere safe so it doesn't escape. And even instances where the dialogue depicts you and Chris as different people. For example, in the Spamton Neo fight in the Snowgrave route, there's an instance where Chris calls out for Ralse and Susie's help, but when it's time to call for Noel's help, it isn't saying that Chris does it, but you. And even Spamton calls you out on it, specifically saying how you're still trying to use her. However, if you think that this is where the route ends, well, you're both right and wrong, because this part can be completely skipped, but that's besides the point. After coming back from the cyber world and leaving the library, you can visit Noel in the hospital where she's looking out for her father. In the normal route, it's mainly a combination of being a lighthearted banter between Noel and her father, but also shows how much he's grown throughout the adventure. In the Snowgrave route, she is still very timid, but when she looks at Chris and Susie enter the room, she quickly leaves out of fear, and when you go follow her, we hear her thoughts of Chris's weird behavior and how no one has noticed yet. But even more interesting is the fact that she mentions a voice unlike Chris's, a terrifying voice, and the fact that you, the player, can even respond to what she's thinking about is just so fucking chilling, dude. Solidifying the fact that at the end of the day, you still do not view Noel as a person or a character. She's just nothing but another puppet to the player, just like Chris. Which perfectly transitions to me talking about one of the best aspects of Deltarune Chapter 2,
Spamton, gee, Spamton.
Dude, Spamton fucking rules. If you ask me how much I love Spamton, just look at my fucking Twitter. I practically draw this man out of mere boredom. And to think he was almost scrapped since playtesters just didn't like him, man, they gotta be smoking on some shit. In other words, look at this dude. He's just the character ever. He's got one of the best designs I've ever seen with a character. Like, goddamn. Well, fuck, okay. So, yeah, me writing a fictional character aside, his placement in the story is very interesting. When you first encounter him, he just seems like another throwaway mini-boss character that's supposed to be a parody of sketchy businessmen or spam email, you know, the name Spamton. However, after his fight, he encourages Chris to go to his secret store in the dump alone. This is completely optional, so if you want to, you can skip that entire part of the game, but if you decide to visit Spamton, then be prepared for an entire can of worms to open up. Once you visit Spamton in his shop, then you're free to buy or sell items with the prices changing often. However, when you decide to talk to him, then things become a whole lot more interesting. There's just something off about him, if you know what I mean. His design, the way he speaks, it's vastly different from the other salesmen we see in the cyber world earlier in the game. And after the Spamton Neo fight, we learn from the other salesmen who are visiting his shop that Spamton wasn't always like this. Back then he was just like the rest, just another salesman down on his luck, but always saying that one day he'll become a big shot. And one day, after getting in contact with a mysterious man on the phone, he becomes successful, but he changes to the point that he seemed unrecognizable to the others, to the point where they leave him, and shortly after his success faded, he crumbled. Spamton also mentions a man twice called Mike in his dialogue, and people, including myself, do think that this mysterious man on the phone could be Mike. There are also times where Spamton breaks characters for a moment and speaks normally, but it gets quickly brushed off until he mentions that whatever he said was specifically towards you. What I find so fascinating about Spamton as a character is that, in a sense, while they are similar, he's practically the polar opposite of Devil in terms of motivation. Like, while Devil is practically embraced by chaos and sees the world as nothing but a worthless game, Spamton practically wants to be freed from both his metaphorical and literal strings attached to him. But let's get back on track. After visiting Spamton and talking to him, he will ask a favor of you, to visit Queen's Castle and retrieve an NCTD card from the basement. After doing so and bringing it back to him, Spamton transfers himself to the CD, deleting the store in the process. Going back to the basement and putting the CD back where it belongs, and nothing really seemed to be happening. That is, once you leave the room. This, my friends, is Spamton Neo, a much stronger form that he hoped would free him from his strings, but unfortunately that wasn't really the case. This is where Spamton now tries to take Chris's soul by force, and once Susie and Rossi drop in, a fight against him begins. And let me just sidetrack here for a moment, his fight is really fucking fun, like, holy shit. Like, his attacks, like, the fact that he had to use the fucking yellow soul from Undertale, but in a different form, his design is just, like, so fucking cool. Wait, where was I? Oh yeah, but at the end of the boss fight, it just seemed really unsettling. Just as we are about to beat him, he's actually very excited about it since he means he's finally gonna be free. But that really isn't the case. He cut the final string and his robotic self just lies there in the ground. Transitioning to a scene where in the first time in the game, he speaks normally saying how the trio of heroes are powerful, but he just remained a puppet. And what's even more interesting is how the trio reacts to all of this after the fight. Susie is confused about everything that happened, while Rossi tries to brush things off like everything that happened wasn't important. But Chris is probably the most interesting reaction. Chris is distressed about this entire thing, and in all honesty, I can kind of see why. Chris and Spamton are a lot more alike the more you think about it, especially the fact you consider that both of them are technically puppets to a much stronger being. For Chris, it's the player, but for Spamton and most likely Devil as well, that answer still remains unknown. So with what I've stated in my overall interest when it comes to how Deltarune has handled its duality in these last 2 chapters, what could we expect in later chapters? Well, to be honest, it's really hard to tell. It could really go either way to how later chapters handle this aspect, and knowing how long chapter 2 took to make, how unexpected it ended up being, plus the fact that Toby himself has stated that chapters 3, 4, and 5 will be releasing at the same time, will likely mean that will probably take a while before we get any form of answer to this question. Or, you know, I'm probably full of shit and it ends up coming out in like a year or 2. I'm Manuel D for Christ's sake. If I'm known for anything, it's for getting shit wrong all the time, so who knows. Plus there's also the fact that Toby mentioned many times that Deltarune will be a game with only one ending. However, he did say that a while back, so maybe he changed his mind. Whatever the case might end up being, the only thing I'm fully confident in is the fact that I'll know that Toby Fox and his team will definitely outdo themselves with what comes next. Anyway, this has been Manuel D, and
Oh dear, it appears your MP4 file has gone missing. But fear not, I know the perfect way to get it back. All I need is your heart-shaped object.
What are you doing here? Are you trying to build up lore? No, get the fuck out of here. I'm done with lore for like, I don't know, ever, maybe. Just leave.
What? Why are you here? This is supposed to be my time to become a big shot. Your time in the spotlight is over.
Okay, thanks for that editing, Manuel. Now, with that out of the way, enjoy the outro for those who actually stick around for that.
We could sun.